Experience the world's #1 AI answer engine for the Catholic Church. Every answer is supported by citations from a vast library of over 18,000 magisterial and Catholic theological texts. Trusted in over 165 countries and 50 languages, Magisterium AI is your partner for faithful, accurate insights. Start your journey for free at magisterium.com.
Hello, everybody. I am John Allen, and this is Last Week in the Church. This is the show where we typically look back over the last week in news in the Vatican and global Catholic beat. This week, however, we are going to be looking back at the last year of Vatican coverage. That intriguing and enigmatic tease will be explained when we come back after our quick break, so please stay where you are. We will be right back. All right, everybody, welcome back. Thanks for being with us. Today is Tuesday, January 7th, in the new year of our Lord, 2025. Hope you all had fantastic and restful holidays wherever you are. Here in Rome, my wife Elise and I had a fantastic break. And as if celebrating our Lord's birth and a new year weren't enough, we also, on Sunday night, which is, of course, the eve of the Feast of the Epiphany, had the great good news that Rome beat Lazio, our crosstown rivals, in the traditional Roman, in English we would say derby, but as the Italians say it, the derby. And if you don't understand this, let me try to explain. Roma Lazio is like Michigan, Ohio State. Doesn't matter how your season is going. If you win that game, everything is right with the world. And Rome won that game. So for us, everything is right for the world. So as I mentioned at the top of the show, this week we are not going to look forward to the first week of 2025, but instead we're going to look back to all of 2024. Now, most media organizations, when they do their year-end review shows, they're looking at the most important, the top stories of the past year. There are plenty of places that do that vis-a-vis the Vatican. So many years ago, I instead adopted the custom of doing the most undercovered Vatican stories of the past year. By that, I mean, not that these stories weren't covered at all, merely that they didn't generate the volume of coverage and commentary that they deserve. So, with no further ado, let me begin my countdown of the top 5 undercovered Vatican stories of 2024. We begin with number 5, the Martinelli verdict. So, this past year, for the very first time in history, a Catholic cleric, a 32-year-old Catholic priest by the name of Gabriele Martinelli, was found guilty of sexual abuse that occurred on Vatican ground. The case arises from a place called the Pre-Seminary of Pius X, which is a kind of formation institute for younger men who are discerning a vocation to the priesthood. It replaces what in America we would typically think of as high school. And this institute, at the time, it was on Vatican grounds. Now, as a result of this case, Pope Francis ordered it out, had to go someplace else. But in any event, the charge was that Martinelli, when he was a senior seminarian, still himself a minor, however, engaged in sexually abusive conduct against another seminarian, in that case, somebody who was younger than him. So not only do we have the very first finding of sexual abuse on Vatican grounds, but for bonus points, it involves, first of all, seminarian on seminarian contact, which is very unusual in terms of the unfolding of the abuse scandals. And also for bonus points, B, the pre-seminary of St. Pius X is sponsored by the Diocese of Como. The Diocese of Como, at the time, was led by a guy who subsequently was made a cardinal by Pope Francis. And so Cardinal Conti of the Diocese of Como is now a prince of the church, despite serious questions about the atmosphere in the pre-seminary of Pius X when all of this was going on. All in all, it was a big deal. Unfortunately, it got dwarfed and obscured by the other big Vatican trial that was going on at the same time, the London trial involving a $400 million land deal and charges of financial misconduct, including the first ever criminal finding of guilt against a cardinal. All right, number 4 on the list, frociagine. So, when Pope Francis in May first said that there was troppa aria di frociagine, which translates roughly into English as too much of an atmosphere of faggotry, in that case he was referring to Catholic seminaries, it created a bit of a global sensation, but it was mostly filed under the news of the weird category. The idea was the Pope of who am I to judge? You know, the most pro-gay Pope in history by virtually any measure could not possibly have used a derogatory term against homosexuals. And so the theory was that, part of it is just that he's getting old and is sort of out of it. And part of it is that he is a non-native Italian speaker, and so certainly did not understand how this term would come off to Italians. This, of course, despite the fact that the Pope's family hails from northern Italy and that he himself has said that he grew up speaking Italian in his house with his grandma as much as he did Spanish, but whatever, that was the takeaway. Now, a month later, when Pope Francis once again said there is troppa aria di frociagine, too much of an atmosphere of faggotry, this time, with respect to the Vatican, it didn't get anything like the same coverage because, of course, it utterly contradicted that earlier narrative. By this point, it was abundantly clear that the Pope knew exactly what he was saying and meant to say it. And here's the bottom line, ladies and gentlemen, that yes, Pope Francis is an enormous pope of outreach to the LGBTQ plus community, but at the same time, he is a pope who believes there is an unhealthily homosexual element to clerical culture generally and to the Vatican specifically. And the fact that a lot of people simply didn't want to hear that accounts for part of the reason why this was one of the year's most undercovered stories. All right, third up, we have labor unrest in the Vatican. Here is a great irony about 2024, that on any countdown of the year's most covered Vatican stories, that is, the stories that generated the most ink, the most airtime, the most commentary, and so on, number 1 would have to be the Synod of Bishops on Synodality, the culmination of this 3-year process launched by Pope Francis that has involved not 1, but 2 synods of bishops, although these are no longer synods of bishops. That implies it's largely a gathering of bishops. These are synods with bishops in the Pope Francis era that include also other male religious, both priests and brothers. It includes sisters and consecrated lay women, and it includes all kinds of lay people, and on and on. And so all of that came to a crescendo, a denouement this October, when you had this month-long final gathering of participants in the Synod to produce this final document. And, the leitmotifs, the idée fixe, I'm channeling all kinds of $5 expressions and words today, but whatever. The key ideas of this final document and of this entire synodal process really were inclusion, dialogue, conversation. I mean, for God's sake, the symbol of the synod was the round table, right? With cardinals and bishops and priests and nuns and lay people with no hierarchy, right? But where everyone was equal and everybody had a stake in the conversation. And yet, the people who were photocopying the documents for this synod, the people who were sweeping up at night and making sure everything was good to go in the morning, the people who were preparing the coffee and the rolls these synod participants were guzzling down every day. In other words, the Vatican workforce, at the very same time, they were saying, hey, what about us? Okay, here's our situation. Our salaries are not indexed to inflation, so their purchasing power has been getting lower with every month that goes along. We, during COVID, our automatic pay increases due to seniority were suspended. For most of us, that's going to mean a $20,000 pay cut over the course of our careers. We're not getting overtime pay. Freezes on hiring means we all have to work longer and harder. And we just got told by the Pope that our pensions might not be there when we get old. So could we please have a conversation about this? The association that represents Vatican lay employees made repeated appeals to officials in the Vatican to sit down and talk with them. Those appeals fell on deaf ears. The point, ladies and gentlemen, is that if the Pope wants to promote a spirit of inclusion and dialogue in the Catholic Church, he might very well start with the people who were on his own payroll, who seem to feel, at least, that they have been dealt out of the process. Vatican law, by the way, makes a strike, what the Italians call the sciopero, illegal. But that doesn't mean there aren't other labor actions at the disposal of a disgruntled workforce. And especially during the Jubilee year, which has just opened up, this could definitely be a storyline to have your eye on. All right, second on our list of the year's most undercovered Vatican stories, a criminal charge in Peru. So, Monsignor Jordi Bertomeu is a Spanish, it's not really completely accurate, he is a Catalan official who is employed in the Vatican's dicastery for the doctrine of the faith. But more importantly, he is one of the two-member sort of special team that the Pope employs to investigate the most egregious sexual abuse cases in the Catholic Church. The other member of that duo is Maltese Archbishop Charles Scicluna. And in 2023, Pope Francis sent that team to Peru to investigate a sort of mounting series of sexual abuse claims against the Sodali Christian Life, or the SCV, which had been founded in 1971 by Peruvian layman Luis Fernando Figari. Now, as part of that process, Bertomeu and Scicluna interrogated. That is, they heard the testimonies of a variety of different people, including a couple of people who have ties to the SCV and whose testimony was basically positive towards the organization. Later, these two individuals made a criminal complaint in Peru against Bertomeu for allegedly leaking both their identities and details of their testimony to the press. Now, we're not even right now going to get into the merits of that charge. I would just note it has been vigorously disputed by other parties. But what's most important is this. This charge should have been laughed out of court in Peru the moment it was filed, as a violation of every codicil of international law that has ever been drawn up. Instead, it is currently before the Peruvian Attorney General for review, meaning there is at least a theoretical possibility that it could go forward. Now, Here is a summary of the problem with this case. Number one, it would represent a violation of the Vatican's sovereignty by eating away at the diplomatic immunity its officials are supposed to enjoy. Scicluna and Bertomeu are not the Vatican's ambassadors to Peru. They don't work at the embassy, which means they don't enjoy the personal immunity that embassy personnel carry. But because they were officials of the Holy See in Peru on official business, they enjoy what's called conduct-based immunity, which is widely recognized under international law. It's been recognized by the International Criminal Court. It's been recognized by the American government and virtually every other government on the face of the earth. So were this case to go forward, it would essentially represent what? A chipping away at Vatican sovereignty. Secondly, there's the obvious religious freedom issue involved here. Should this case go forward, it would essentially put a secular state in the position of judging how a religious organization ought to run its internal affairs. That is a classic violation of religious freedom. And then finally, third, this would impede the Vatican's ability to conduct investigations of sexual abuse charges around the world at a time when pretty much the unanimous global chorus is that the Vatican needs to deliver swift and sure justice for these kinds of offenses. The point is, this is an extraordinary serious case. And the fact that it has generated virtually no international coverage or interest, frankly, is nothing short of flabbergasting. I mean, it is true, of course, that this outfit, the SCV, has a reputation for, filing lawsuits against people for any kind of coverage it doesn't like. But that doesn't really justify the fact that, basically speaking, the global media has dropped the ball on this story, because something far more important than the fate of the SCV is at stake here. It's the Vatican's sovereignty, its religious freedom, and it's the fight against sexual abuse in all of its forms. As if that wasn't enough, ladies and gentlemen, we come to item number one on our countdown of the year's most undercovered Vatican stories, and that is the mounting crisis in Catholic-Jewish relations. 2024 began with a lecture at the prestigious Jesuit-run Gregorian University by Rabbi Riccardo de Segni, the chief rabbi of Rome, warning of a new crisis in Jewish Catholic relations because of responses by the Vatican and in broader Catholic circles to Israel's war against Hamas in Gaza. And it ended with three separate vignettes. One was a furor set off by scenes of Pope Francis in his wheelchair, gazing upon a nativity set in which the baby Jesus was resting upon a keffiyeh, a black and white checkered keffiyeh, which is the symbol of Palestinian resistance. That occurred in the Vatican audience hall. And then there was a furor because the Pope, in his December 21st address to the Roman Curia, claimed that the Latin Rite Patriarch of Jerusalem, Italian Patriarch Pier Battista Pizzaballa, had been denied access to Gaza to celebrate his traditional pre-Christmas liturgy by the Israeli authorities. The Israeli embassy to the Holy See immediately, like minutes later, posted a statement claiming this was a complete falsehood. And in point of fact, the very next day, Pizzaballa and his delegation was in Gaza, as had been previously scheduled, carrying out the religious rituals, delivering aid, and so on. The other element of that December 21st address to the Curia was Pope Francis saying that also the day before, that children had died because of airstrikes in Gaza, and that the death of children was not war, it was cruelty. This, of course, outraged many Israelis and many Jewish leaders, because the suggestion appeared to have been that the Israelis had intentionally targeted these children. The Israeli Foreign Ministry put out a lengthy statement saying this wasn't true, and ending with basically saying, enough with the double standards, enough with holding Israel accountable, not Hamas. Why don't you talk about Hamas, for instance, intentionally putting children in harm's way, using them as human shields in an effort to prevent retribution for their actions? So those are the issues that occurred towards the end of the year. Now, since then, there have been other flashpoints. Really quickly, too, on December 24th, when I emphasize December 24th, Christmas Eve, when Catholic clergy typically have other things to do, the Israeli Foreign Ministry summoned the Vatican's ambassador in Italy to hear what the Israeli described not as a reprimand, but as serious disagreement with what the Pope had said about Gaza. And then flash forward 10 days later to January 4th, when the Pope received in audience an Iranian rector of a university. And according to a story afterwards on Iran's state-sponsored news agency, he told that rector that, hey, we don't have any problem with the Jews. Our problem is with Netanyahu, who has created crises, in the region and around the world, regardless of international law and human rights, which of course led many Israelis and Jewish leaders to ask, wait a minute, you're singling out Netanyahu for having a problem with international law and human rights, but you don't mention Hamas? Hello, double standard, anyone? So all of this has led to a situation in which, if enough attention wasn't paid to Jewish-Catholic relations in 2024, it will have to be paid to Jewish-Catholic relations in 2025, because if we don't, the risk is there's not going to be any relation left to talk about. All right, that's our rundown of the year's top 5 most undercovered stories. Hope you enjoyed it. Of course, you can find full coverage of this story and everything else pertaining to the Vatican and the global church on the Crux site. That is www.cruxnow.com. Thank you for being with us this week. We will be back here next week, same bat time, same bat channel. In the meantime, stay safe, stay healthy, be happy, be on top of the world, and remember that no matter what else happens, we will see each other again on this space and at this time very soon.